Alright y'all, welcome back to the channel because women's basketball just got another dramatic twist. And this time, the internet thinks Dawn Staley is becoming way too powerful for the rest of the sport to handle. Now look, this is bigger than one game, one rivalry, or one press conference. Because after that heated Final Four moment with Geno Auriemma, people online started realizing something crazy. The energy around women's basketball has completely changed. For years, UConn felt untouchable. Geno controlled the culture, the headlines, the dynasty conversations. But now, fans think Dawn Staley has officially taken over as the face of power in the sport. And honestly, Geno's reaction after losing only made the conversation even louder. The internet went crazy after he publicly apologized and called himself a dumbass over the tension with Dawn. But fans were not just reacting to the apology, they were reacting to what it represented. A lot of people believe women's basketball is entering a completely new era where Dawn Staley, not UConn, controls the spotlight now. And here's where things get even crazier. Some insiders think Dawn's influence now goes beyond coaching, recruiting, media attention, player branding, culture, future WNBA stars. Somehow her name keeps ending up in the center of all of it. Which means this may no longer just be about basketball anymore. This might be about who really controls the future of women's sports. And honestly, the reason this conversation around Dawn Staley feels so intense right now is because people are starting to realize her influence goes way beyond wins and losses. This is not just about South Carolina being successful anymore. This is about one coach slowly becoming the center of gravity in women's basketball, while the rest of the sport tries to adjust around her. That is why the internet reacted so strongly after the Final Four tension with Geno Auriemma. Because fans did not just see two legendary coaches exchanging words after a heated game. They saw symbolism. They saw what looked like the old power structure of women's basketball colliding directly with the new era taking over in real time. For years, UConn controlled almost everything culturally in the sport. Championships, attention, recruiting dominance, media narratives. If people talked about women's basketball dynasties, the conversation started with Geno automatically. But now, the spotlight feels different. Every major storyline somehow circles back to Dawn Staley. Recruiting battles, conversations, player empowerment, TV ratings, social media popularity, future WNBA stars. Her fingerprints suddenly feel connected to every major shift happening inside the sport. And honestly, that level of influence is making some people uncomfortable whether they admit it publicly or not. Because once one coach becomes bigger than the traditional system itself, power dynamics start changing fast. Now here's what makes this even more interesting. Dawn Staley's rise happened during the exact moment women's basketball exploded into mainstream culture. That timing matters a lot more than people realize. A few years ago, women's basketball still struggled constantly for national attention compared to men's sports coverage. Now, the entire environment looks different. Arena crowds are larger. Television ratings are skyrocketing. Players are becoming celebrities before entering the WNBA. Social media clips go viral overnight. NIL money changed recruiting forever. And through all of that growth, Dawn Staley positioned herself perfectly at the center of the movement. That is why younger fans connect with her differently than older coaching legends. Dawn does not feel distant from the players emotionally. She feels culturally connected to the current generation. Players openly admire her leadership style, personality, confidence, and willingness to defend athletes publicly. And in today's sports culture, that emotional connection matters almost as much as winning championships. Now suddenly, rival fan bases are starting to notice something else. Top recruits keep gravitating toward programs connected to Dawn's energy. Even athletes who never play for South Carolina often speak about her influence respectfully. That is a major shift because it means her impact is extending beyond her own roster. When one coach begins shaping how players think about branding, confidence, activism, and visibility across the sport, that coach becomes more than just a strategist. They become a cultural force. And honestly, that may explain why the Geno situation exploded online the way it did. Because the public reaction was emotional, not just competitive. Fans interpreted Geno's frustration as symbolic of something bigger happening underneath the surface. They saw one era fading while another one became stronger publicly. Then when Gino later apologized and criticized his own behavior, social media treated it almost like confirmation that the balance of power inside women's basketball had officially shifted. Now obviously not everybody agrees with that narrative. There are still many people who believe UConn remains the standard historically no matter what happens currently. Others think social media exaggerates drama around Dawn Staley because controversy drives engagement online. But even many critics admit something important. Nobody controls the conversation in women's basketball right now more consistently than Dawn Staley. That kind of influence creates pressure, because the bigger her platform becomes, the more every move gets analyzed publicly. Every quote becomes debate content online. Every roster decision becomes national discussion. Every emotional reaction on the sideline spreads across sports media instantly. And unlike older eras where coaches operated quietly behind the scenes, today's sports environment turns personalities into brands whether they want it or not. Dawn understands that reality better than most coaches. That is why many insiders believe her influence keeps growing instead of slowing down. She adapts naturally to modern sports culture instead of fighting against it. Social media visibility, player empowerment, NIL conversations, public advocacy, media narratives. She operates comfortably inside all of it, while some traditional programs still seem uncomfortable adjusting to the new landscape. And trust me, recruits notice that difference immediately, because today's athletes are thinking differently than players did even 5 years ago. They want development, but they also want visibility. They want support, branding opportunities, confidence, and coaches who understand modern pressure. Dawn Staley represents all of those things at once, which makes South Carolina feel less like a basketball program sometimes and more like a launching platform for future stars. That is exactly why some people believe Dawn is becoming too powerful inside the sport. Not because she wins games, because she influences culture. And once a coach starts influencing culture itself, traditional power structures usually become nervous very quickly, which honestly may explain why every major women's basketball conversation suddenly feels emotionally charged now. This is no longer only about championships. It is about who controls the future image of the sport itself. And judging by how much attention Dawn Staley commands right now, many fans already think that future may belong to her. And honestly, that cultural influence may be exactly why people around women's basketball suddenly sound so emotional whenever Dawn Staley's name enters the conversation. Because this is no longer only about coaching records or tournament wins. Dawn has become something much bigger than a basketball coach to many fans watching the sport evolve in real time. She represents change. And whenever change happens in sports, there is always tension between the old guard and the new generation trying to take over. That is why the reaction after the Gino Arima situation felt so intense online. Fans were not just arguing over a handshake line moment. They were debating what the moment represented symbolically. For decades, Gino and UConn basically defined women's college basketball excellence. Their dominance shaped the entire culture around the sport. But now, social media users increasingly talk about Dawn Staley like she is the new center of power entirely. That shift feels huge emotionally for longtime basketball fans, especially because Dawn's leadership style feels completely different from the traditional coaching image many people grew up watching. She speaks directly. She protects her players publicly. She understands internet culture. She embraces athlete personalities instead of trying to control every aspect of them publicly. And younger audiences connect strongly with that energy because it feels modern, authentic, and emotionally intelligent compared to older sports systems built more around strict authority. Now here is where things become even more fascinating. Some analysts believe Dawn Staley's real power is not just attracting top players. It is making South Carolina feel culturally important. Think about it. There are many successful programs in women's basketball, but very few programs feel like they influence national conversations beyond sports fans themselves. South Carolina somehow crossed into mainstream culture territory. Celebrity attention, viral clips, fashion conversations, social commentary, political conversations, player branding. The program constantly exists in spaces far beyond basketball courts now. And Dawn sits directly at the center of that ecosystem. That level of visibility changes recruiting dramatically. Because today's athletes are not only choosing where to play basketball anymore, they are choosing where they can build influence, visibility, branding opportunities, future media careers, no growth, professional recognition. And honestly, many young athletes now see Dawn Staley almost like a mentor for navigating modern sports fame itself. That makes her incredibly powerful. Now rival fanbases are quietly starting to worry about another thing too. South Carolina keeps staying relevant even after roster turnover. Usually powerhouse programs lose momentum when stars leave for the WNBA or graduation. But somehow Dawn reloads constantly, while still maintaining emotional connection with fans nationally. That consistency is rare in modern college sports where roster movement and transfer portal chaos create instability everywhere. And trust me, rival coaches definitely notice it. Because building one championship team is hard enough already. Building a culture where elite players continue trusting the system year after year is much harder. Dawn seems to have created an environment where players genuinely believe they can develop as athletes, public figures, and future professionals simultaneously. That combination is dangerous, especially now that women's basketball is exploding commercially. Because let's be real, the sport is entering a completely different financial era right now. Television networks suddenly care deeply about ratings. Brands are investing heavily. Social media attention keeps growing. WNBA visibility is higher than ever. And once money and mainstream attention increase, influence inside the sport becomes even more important. That is why some people believe Dawn's influence could eventually reshape the entire recruiting structure of women's basketball long term. And honestly, that possibility makes traditional programs nervous, because the old formula for dominance may not work forever anymore. Historically, certain schools controlled the sport mainly through prestige, championships, and history. But modern athletes think differently. They want visibility, empowerment, branding opportunities, emotional support, and coaches who understand public pressure in the digital era. Dawn Staley appears perfectly built for this moment culturally. That is why even criticism against her often ends up strengthening her visibility instead of hurting it. Every debate online about Dawn becomes more exposure for South Carolina. Every emotional sports show segment discussing her creates more attention. Every viral social media argument introduces her program to newer audiences. And in modern sports culture, attention itself becomes power incredibly fast. Now obviously, there are critics who think this entire conversation gets exaggerated by internet hype. Some believe people are turning women's basketball into reality television, instead of focusing purely on competition. Others think media coverage around Dawn sometimes overshadows other great coaches unfairly. But even many critics admit something important privately. Dawn Staley understands this era better than almost anyone else. She knows how to lead athletes publicly without sounding disconnected from younger generations. She knows how to navigate controversy without losing authority. And she knows how to keep South Carolina emotionally relevant even when the season ends. That is extremely difficult to do consistently, which honestly may explain why conversations around her feel bigger every year instead of smaller. The more women's basketball grows, the more valuable Dawn's style of leadership becomes in this new environment. And now many fans are starting to wonder something quietly. What happens if Dawn Staley keeps winning while also controlling the culture around the sport at the same time? Because if that happens, she may not just become the most influential coach of this era. She could become the defining figure of modern women's basketball itself. And honestly, that possibility is exactly what has people around women's basketball paying so much attention to Dawn Staley right now. Because if she keeps controlling both the championships and the culture surrounding the sport, then the entire balance of power could shift permanently for the next generation. And trust me, many people already believe that shift has quietly started. You can feel it in the way players talk about her. You can see it in recruiting battles. You can even hear it in how media coverage around women's basketball has changed recently. There was a time when conversations about the sport always centered around traditional powerhouse systems and historic programs. Now, personality, branding, empowerment, and visibility dominate the conversation almost every day. And Dawn Staley somehow fits perfectly into all of those worlds simultaneously. That is why younger fans connect with her so strongly. She does not feel like an untouchable old-school authority figure. She feels accessible, relatable, emotionally aware. Players openly talk about how supported they feel around her. And in today's sports culture, emotional trust matters more than many people realize publicly. Especially now that athletes deal with nonstop internet pressure, social media criticism, nil expectations, and celebrity-level attention before even becoming professionals. Dawn understands all of it naturally. And honestly, that may be one of the biggest reasons rival programs suddenly sound nervous whenever South Carolina enters recruiting conversations. Because they are not only competing against championships anymore, they are competing against a complete cultural machine built around visibility, trust, empowerment, and relevance. That combination is hard to fight. Now, another thing people are noticing online is how often Dawn Staley's influence extends outside of basketball entirely. Politicians mention her. Celebrities support her publicly. Athletes from other sports praise her leadership style. Media personalities constantly discuss her impact beyond wins and losses. That type of crossover influence used to belong mostly to legendary male coaches or global sports icons. Now Dawn is entering that territory herself. And honestly, many longtime sports fans still have not fully processed how significant that is for women's basketball historically. Because once a coach becomes culturally influential outside the sport itself, they gain a completely different level of authority publicly. Suddenly their opinions matter beyond basketball strategy. Their leadership style becomes part of national conversations. Their program starts feeling symbolic of larger social and cultural shifts happening in sports generally. That is exactly what seems to be happening around South Carolina right now. And the more attention Dawn receives, the stronger that cycle becomes. Now here is another layer people are starting to discuss quietly: jealousy. Because let's be honest, sports history shows that whenever one figure becomes extremely influential, backlash usually follows eventually. Some fans already believe Dawn receives too much media praise compared to other successful coaches. Others think television networks intentionally push her storylines harder because they know she drives ratings and engagement. And with women's basketball becoming more competitive nationally, emotions around these conversations keep getting more intense. But honestly, that backlash may actually prove how powerful she has become. People rarely debate coaches this passionately, unless they genuinely believe those coaches are shaping the future direction of the sport itself. And right now, Dawn Staley's fingerprints feel connected to almost every major shift happening around women's basketball growth. The rise of athlete branding, the rise of player empowerment, the increase in mainstream media attention, the emotional connection younger fans feel toward athletes and coaches. Dawn sits at the center of all of it. That is why even moments like the Geno situation become much bigger online than normal sports disagreements. Fans interpreted that exchange emotionally because they saw two different eras colliding publicly. One built around traditional dominance structures. The other built around personality, culture, empowerment, and modern visibility. And honestly, the internet already chose which direction it believes the sport is moving toward. Now suddenly there are even conversations about whether Dawn Staley's coaching tree and leadership style could influence future WNBA culture too. Think about that for a second. College coaches rarely impact professional narratives this heavily. But because so many elite players now enter the WNBA carrying massive social media followings and public influence from college already, coaches shaping those athletes beforehand become more important than ever. And Dawn seems completely comfortable operating inside that modern reality. That comfort level matters. Because many traditional sports figures still appear uncomfortable with how public and emotional modern athletics has become. Dawn embraces it instead of resisting it. She understands visibility is not the enemy anymore. Attention drives growth. Emotional connection drives fandom. Personality drives engagement. And women's basketball is benefiting massively from all three things right now, which honestly may explain why her influence keeps expanding instead of slowing down. The sport itself is evolving in a direction that naturally increases the value of everything Dawn already represents. And that is exactly why some people around basketball are starting to ask a very uncomfortable question privately. What happens if Dawn Staley's model becomes the future blueprint for the entire sport? Because if that happens, then this is no longer just a conversation about one successful coach. It becomes a conversation about who truly controls the next era of women's basketball power itself. And honestly, that question may be exactly why conversations around Dawn Staley suddenly feel so emotionally charged everywhere online. Because deep down, people are realizing this is not only about South Carolina winning games anymore. This is about a coach potentially redefining what power looks like in women's sports during one of the biggest growth periods the industry has ever seen. And that realization makes some people very excited, while making others extremely uncomfortable. Because for years, women's basketball followed a more traditional structure where certain powerhouse programs controlled the spotlight almost automatically. Legacy mattered more than personality. Systems mattered more than branding. Coaches stayed mostly inside basketball conversations instead of becoming larger cultural figures publicly. But now, everything feels different. Today's fans do not only connect to teams anymore. They connect to personalities, emotions, confidence, and visibility. They want authenticity. They want drama. They want emotional investment. And whether people agree with it or not, Dawn Staley understands how to operate in that environment better than almost anyone else in the sport. That is why South Carolina feels bigger than basketball sometimes. The program has become emotionally connected to modern sports culture itself. Players become stars nationally before even reaching the WNBA. Press conferences trend online. Rivalries feel personal. Social media discussions explode after almost every major game. And somehow Dawn remains calm while controlling the center of all that attention at the same time. That combination is incredibly rare. Now, another reason this conversation keeps growing is because younger athletes openly admire Dawn in ways that feel deeper than normal coach-player respect. Many players talk about her leadership almost like mentorship beyond sports. Confidence, identity, handling pressure, public criticism, personal growth. Those conversations matter because modern athletes are dealing with completely different pressures compared to older generations. Imagine being 19 years old while millions of people analyze your every game online instantly. Imagine carrying nil expectations, social media pressure, celebrity attention, and professional expectations simultaneously before even reaching the WNBA. That environment can destroy confidence very quickly. But many players believe Dawn prepares athletes emotionally for that reality instead of hiding from it. And honestly, that may become one of the most valuable skills any coach can offer moving forward as women's basketball keeps growing commercially. Because the spotlight is only getting bigger. And trust me, television networks know it. Sports companies know it. Sponsors know it. That is why women's basketball coverage suddenly feels much more aggressive and emotional than before. Rivalries are marketed harder. Personalities matter more. Social media moments spread instantly. And coaches capable of navigating that pressure become incredibly valuable to the future growth of the sport. Dawn Staley fits that role perfectly. Now, obviously, not everybody loves the direction women's basketball is heading culturally. There are critics who think too much focus now goes toward internet drama and celebrity storylines instead of pure basketball fundamentals. Others believe social media narratives unfairly turn certain coaches into larger-than-life figures while overshadowing the sport itself sometimes. But honestly, sports history shows this transformation happens every time a league or sport explodes into mainstream culture. The NBA changed when personalities became global brands. The NFL changed when media attention intensified around player identities. Women's basketball is now experiencing its own version of that evolution in real time. And Dawn Staley appears positioned directly in the center of it. That is why people keep describing her as too powerful now. Not because she controls everything literally, but because her influence stretches across so many areas simultaneously. Recruiting, media narratives, player trust, public image, cultural conversations, visibility, future WNBA development. Few coaches in any sport reach that level of influence while still actively competing for championships. And honestly, the scariest part for rival programs may be this. Dawn does not look overwhelmed by the pressure at all. She looks comfortable, almost energized by the attention surrounding the sport's growth. That confidence changes everything because athletes naturally gravitate toward leaders who seem fully prepared for modern pressure. And right now, many recruits likely view South Carolina as one of the safest places to build both basketball success and personal influence at the same time. That is an incredibly powerful recruiting weapon, especially now that women's basketball has become one of the fastest-growing spaces in American sports culture. So when fans online debate whether Dawn Staley is becoming too powerful, what they are really debating is something much deeper. They are debating whether one coach has figured out the future of women's basketball before everyone else fully catches up. And honestly, judging by how the sport keeps evolving, that possibility no longer sounds unrealistic at all. Because every year the game becomes louder. Every year visibility becomes more important. Every year player branding becomes more valuable. And every year Dawn Staley somehow seems even more connected to the center of all of it. Which means the rest of women's basketball may eventually face a very uncomfortable reality. This may not just be Dawn Staley's moment. It may be Dawn Staley's era. And honestly, this conversation around Dawn Staley feels like it is only getting bigger. Because the more women's basketball grows, the more influence certain personalities are going to have over the future of the sport. And right now, whether people love it or hate it, Dawn Staley feels like the center of almost every major conversation happening in women's basketball. But now I want to hear from you. Do you think Dawn Staley is truly becoming the most powerful figure in women's basketball right now? Or do you think social media is overhyping her influence because controversy and rivalries drive clicks online? And be honest, has South Carolina officially replaced UConn as the new powerhouse everybody is chasing? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this debate is getting real emotional across the internet right now. Also make sure you subscribe and turn notifications on because the second more drama, rivalries, recruiting news, or behind-the-scenes stories start exploding around women's basketball, we are covering all of it immediately. Because trust me, the deeper this new era of women's basketball goes, the more intense these power shifts are going to become. And something tells me Dawn Staley is nowhere near finished yet.